Hello, I'm Justin Smith, and it's day 4 of the Listen Now week. And this week is dedicated to having open conversations about suicide. And well done to Tobin Brothers Funerals, who have put this together. And you may think it's strange, you may think it's odd that a funeral company has decided that they wanted to have a week campaign of talking about suicide. But the reason is that they are just burying person after person that should have lived a long and healthy life, and they didn't. They killed themselves. And Tobin Brothers have just seen so much of that they wanted to put this together so we can have these open conversations and try to reach people. Today, we're talking to some of the first responders, some of the people that are at the front line of suicides. And you can only imagine the ambulance service and the paramedics, what they go through and the things that they need to deal with and the things that they see. Tony Walker is the CEO of Ambulance Victoria, and he's a great guy. He has been part of the change of the way we talk and the way we discuss things like mental health and suicide. And also, like Graham Ashton, the former Chief Commissioner of Police, Tony has been open in talking about his own battles. I was speaking with John and Sue Stebbins, who lost their son about 30 years ago to suicide. And they do counselling. They help out with counselling now and deal with help other parents and grandparents. And there's just a trail of misery.
No, it's horrendous. It touches all of us in some ways, and it leaves a void. I think it's that sense of loss. Well, I've never lost anyone really close to me to suicide. I've lost colleagues, and it is that sense of loss. I think that permeates, and the sense of could I have done something? That plays out. I know in my mind and the mind of others. Did we see anything? Did we miss something? It's horrendous.
I guess AMBOs, paramedics would have always known, people that have worked for many years as paramedics have always known that suicide is a very, very real thing that lives amongst us. And in the last few years, we start to talk about it a little more. You wonder where the paramedics sort of look and say, I know. Now you see, it's bad in the community. It's a very bad thing.
It's been, it's part of the nature of the work we do, and often it's the families that and when you speak to our paramedics about suicide, what they'll often say is it's the emotional impact of dealing with the families, and particularly when you're dealing with teenagers, for example. The closeness that can have to their own lives, but then dealing with this overwhelming grief of families who have experienced it. It doesn't. It never leaves you. I think it's fair to say. I know from the cases I've attended, they're the sorts of cases that you never forget. They're probably with you for the rest of your life in some ways.
There's such a different grief that seems to go with it from people that I've talked to. There's a very, very different grief that is attached. And I think part of that is not being able to connect with other people because we don't talk about it openly, that you're not able to connect with other people the same way that you would with cancer or the road toll or even just somebody, a natural end to their life. The conversation almost gets shut down before it starts.
It does, and I've heard of parents, for example, and loved ones who when they know that their loved one has committed suicide using their vehicle, have never wanted to talk about it anything other than a car accident because of the fact that society doesn't want to talk about it. And the impact of that inability to share and inability to grieve openly. Can have huge impacts on people, and they live with it for the rest of their lives.
Is it because of that question, the big why? Families and friends will have that question of why. They're never really able to answer that. So therefore, we're never really able to have that conversation about it openly because we just don't know.
I think that's a valid point. That sense of you don't know what was sitting there unless there's a note or something that's left. You don't know what was sitting in their heads at the time. it's, as you said before, it's not like someone dying naturally, someone being in an accident. It's you can rationalise in some ways what's occurred. But it's hard. Again, not having been experienced it directly myself, but again, people around me, it's that sense of why, and that why sits with you, and that constant, could I have done more? That sense of guilt, that maybe did I miss something here?
How do you go keeping an eye on your guys? I mean, they're in a very vulnerable job, aren't they? Because of some of the heartache they've got to be exposed to, some of the natural pressures of a job like that. How do you keep an eye on them?
Well, it's an ongoing issue for us. I've got to say, the mental health and wellbeing of our workforce is an ongoing concern to me and all of us at AB. We focus very heavily historically on the response services, where we've got great psychologists, peer support, etc. But it become clear to us over the last few years that's almost the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It's almost the sense of you wait for the emergency and you deal with it. We've now focused a lot more at the front end. So how do we select the right people to make sure that they've got the right attributes when they start with the organisation? How do we work around resilience? So how do we build up some level of resilience and acknowledge that, interestingly, you grow from your experiences. So not every difficult experience is going to have a negative impact. That there's this post-traumatic growth that can occur amongst emergency service workers and others. So we need to acknowledge that as well, and make sure we're not over paternalising, if you like, what's occurring, but support them through dealing with that issue. Our psychologists are very big on that, and working very strongly on acknowledging it's okay that this stigma issue, that the way you feel is a normal way to feel, and with the right support, you can most of us get through it. Most of us will come through the other end. Some of the times we don't. There's great support to help you, either at the self-managing end or getting that professional support. So we're monitoring constantly. Our peer teams contact people after difficult cases just to make sure they're travelling okay. We're doing debriefs with them to just allow them to talk amongst their friends at gatherings, we often call them. And that normalising, it's a normal way to feel, and it's okay to feel that way, and it's okay to put your hand up if you need some help.
I mean, I've talked to a lot of police officers that talk about the old days of you go through an horrendous moment and then you have a beer and then you don't talk about it again, and you're lucky to even talk about it over that beer. It's to have a beer, talk a bit of crap, and then forget about it and don't discuss it again. Well, as we know, that's just a disaster and has never, ever worked. It has only pushed down, and probably, that approach, unknown to the people doing it, that approach destroyed a lot of lives. We're better at that now, I guess, talking, that constant talk.
Yeah, it's interesting. About 2 or 3 years ago, I went to the retirement of one of our paramedics. He'd been a long-serving employee, but about 35 years, a lovely guy. And he got up and spoke, and, he talked about the fact that when he first started, you saw the worst of everything. You're out doing rescues, it was yourself in a country branch with the local police officer. And he said that's exactly how they dealt with it. They went to the pub and got pissed on a Friday night to try and deal with it. And he said that took its toll on him over time. And I often see many people of that vintage who are broken. They've really been impacted on by their experiences over their career, and they're the ones that we're there to help as much as we can. But there's also that point at the front end there. How do we make sure people never find themselves in that same situation again? That they feel that's the only way they've got to deal with the issues. I agree with you. I think it's better today than it was, but we do know that emergency services workers, paramedics, are no different. They have a high use of alcohol. They will self-medicate, self-manage, and we need to be upfront about that and recognise that sometimes the support they need is actually around some of those support and counselling services, not necessarily the traditional psychology ones.
Have you seen some of your crew that have struggled and you think, by gee, I'm really glad that we've got a different approach, because I think that we kind of saved that one because we're doing it differently.
Absolutely. We look at our history, and we look at, back in 2015, we did some work with the unions and the government and the coronial services area to look at suicide in ambulance. And paramedics were 3 times more likely than the general than other emergency services, and 4 times more likely the general community to commit suicide. And that was a wake-up call for us in the sense of we hadn't realised it was as bad. We knew we'd lost people, but we didn't realise it was as bad as it was. And since then, we look at the fact that the numbers of suicides we know have not been as high over the last few years. But I've got to say the number of near misses is still up there. So I sit there and say, quite strongly, whilst we're not seeing the numbers we saw a few years ago, there, but the grace of God, there's a lot of people who are very unwell, who because of the right support and getting caught at the right times we've been able to intervene with them and prevent a suicide. But I know equally tomorrow I could get the phone call that I dread to tell me that one of our staff has taken their own lives, and it's still a risk and will continue to be a risk. I think
it's not going to go away, is it? Not at all.
Not at all.
What? How do you want to see people talk about it? Media, general community, families, in your workplace. Do we need to change the conversation, or are we doing okay at the moment?
I think we're getting better, Justin, than we were, but we're not there yet. So I think for me, a society where we feel as comfortable as any other condition talking about suicide, as equally amongst any other mental health condition, is one I'd like to see. And we're not there yet. There's still that stigma, as we were talking about before, attached to suicide. So I think I think we're getting better. I know in our own organisation we've been talking about it a lot more. The days of not being upfront about it, the days of thinking if you talk about it you're going to cause it, I think that's been broken down quite strongly. And so now we're talking about suicide. We're talking about suicide ideation, and it is an issue for emergency services. The Beyond Blue work did highlight that suicide ideation is much higher amongst emergency services workers.
Yes.
They're more likely to have a suicide plan. So we know it's an issue that people are experiencing. We need to be talking about it even more and breaking down that stigma. Would
you like to see, we wouldn't like to see, but should we see something like the approach to the road toll, where we have a count, it almost looks like a scoreboard sometimes, doesn't it? The road toll and heroin deaths almost looks like a scoreboard, and we can't turn it into that. But would you like to see us take stock of how many we've lost and to fully, to publicise that and to say, look, we are losing these people. We didn't need to lose these people, but they're gone.
So the answer is yes. I think in the sense of, I agree, we've got to be careful it doesn't become a ladder, in the sense of the numbers, but because each number is a life. But what we can talk about, I think, is the fact that we know that, 8 people commit suicide, die from suicide a day. We know those numbers are out there. That's important to talk about. And it's important to talk about the fact that those are members of our community, people who have, who've often been taken in the prime of their life, and the fact that, we need to do something about that. We need to understand as much as we can why it occurred, and we need to, so the numbers by the nature do create that conversation.
Yes.
But I think they're more powerful when they're linked to a story, and that's often hard because families often don't want to share those stories. It's deeply personal, but that's where often when you see families, as you mentioned before, get up there and talk about the loss.
Those stories are important, and when you look at something like the road toll, we are learning not simply because the road toll is at a certain number. We're learning because we say, well, look, you've got to wipe off 5, don't drink and drive, make sure you wear your seatbelt, be alert, blah, blah. We put a story to that. And sometimes we say, well, look, this person was killed because this person was driving and they were distracted by their mobile phone. So there's a little story that goes with that. I hadn't sort of thought about it in those terms before. If we're telling those stories about people and how they got to that point of suicide, then maybe, forget the numbers, we can, or publicising the numbers, we just start telling those stories a hell of a lot more.
Yeah, and often where families are saying, particularly if families are having to identify some of the pressures and things, I know within the medical workforce there's been a lot more, like Jeff Toogood and others are doing some great work in talking about their own lived experience with attempted suicide and mental health issues, and other medicos are talking about that. I think it's incredibly powerful because it helps when you look at it going, oh gosh, I'm under some of those pressures.
Yes.
Do I need to talk to someone about my mental health? It's a braveness, if you like, of the families being prepared to share those stories can I think make an impact to others.
Can I ask you, if it's not too personal, what do you do now if you feel that pressure? What do you do when
Yeah.
you to release that or to talk about it?
Yeah, no, it's not personal at all. In fact, I'm very open about talking about my mental health. So I see a psychologist regularly. So I see a psychologist every 6 months just to check in, like I do my GP. I found that invaluable, and I often describe to people that I've been part of Ambulance Victoria for 34 years. I've had lots of opportunity to touch our services, our psychological services. I haven't used them. So
Yeah,
up until 10 years ago, when my first marriage broke down, that was the time I thought I think I need to talk to someone. And I often describe to my colleagues that it took me 10 times to pick up that phone. I picked it up 10 times and I put it back down going, this is ridiculous. I do not need help. I can deal with this issue.
yeah,
It's stupid.
yeah.
And I've got to say, the first pick up that phone and have that conversation with a psychologist was the best thing I ever did. And I talked to a lot of my colleagues about that, and they share the same experiences. Once you share your issues and realise actually it's not insurmountable, and you can work through it. It makes the world of difference. I wish I had been using a psychologist 30 years ago, because it's made a world of difference to me. The other things for me are recognising, and we do a lot of work in Ambulance Victoria around using the Canadian mental health continuum, which is a nice tool to help you look at, instead of you're looking at, have I got depression, have I got anxiety, you're actually looking at, how am I feeling today?
Yes.
You're in the green zone. We're in the green zone most days. Most of us are probably in the amber at the moment because of the lockdowns and things that go with that. But you can look at the way you're feeling, look at the symptoms and go, I can self-manage that. So I'm not, the last couple of weeks, haven't been sleeping as well as I need to. So I've been focusing on a bit more activity and exercise to try and sleep better, which is working.
Yeah.
That doesn't work, and you know that things are getting worse, then it's time to get some professional help. So using those sort of tools help me and help others to sort of work out, check in where you're at and look at doing things to help manage it.
But if you weren't seeing that psychologist every 6 months, you may not be as good at that. You may not reach those conclusions on your own. So you go in there and you put the car up on the blocks and you do all the checking, and yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And instead of waiting for that white knuckle moment, not to be flippant about it, but you wait for that moment where you're really stressed and panicking. But yeah, you check in on yourself beforehand.
Yeah. I'm using the analogy of my GP. I don't want to be popping in to see my GP or an emergency department the first time I get chest pain. I want to be doing the preventative work up front to avoid that. It's the same principle around mental health, and recognising there's no stigma attached to seeing a psychologist. It's actually, if one of my colleagues calls it a checkup from the neck up, it's a great way of making sure you're doing okay. And as you say, put the engine up on the blocks and make sure, you're travelling okay. And the good thing about doing it for us is we see a psychologist regularly. A lot of us do at WAB. There's an opportunity then to go, well, actually, when last time we saw you 6 months ago, you were drinking a little bit more, you're drinking a bit more now. It's a really good way just to check in, because these things can be a bit insidious and creep up on you. And it's often when a crisis occurs, then you realise, actually, I've been struggling for months and it just hadn't shown up.
Tony, it's so good to talk to you, mate. Thanks for being so candid, and thanks for doing what you do. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure.